In the middle of the 20th century, while America celebrated post-war prosperity and industrial growth, another world quietly matured beneath the surface of Detroit. The city was booming, fueled by factories that never slept and assembly lines that promised steady paychecks and upward mobility. To outsiders, Detroit looked like a symbol of progress. To those who knew how power truly moved, it was a chessboard where influence mattered more than noise, patience mattered more than force, and silence could be more powerful than fear. At the center of this shadowed structure stood Joseph Zerilli, a man whose name rarely appeared in headlines yet echoed in every serious conversation about organized crime in the Midwest. Joseph Zerilli was not built like the men Hollywood celebrates. He did not seek the spotlight, nor did he cultivate a reputation through violence or theatrics. His strength came from restraint. His authority came from trust, loyalty, and an instinctive understanding of how criminal organizations survived long-term. While others chased fast money or short-lived dominance, Zerilli focused on permanence. He believed power was most effective when it went unnoticed. Born into an Italian immigrant family, Zerilli grew up with an understanding of discipline, hierarchy, and survival. Like many children of immigrants, he learned early that success in America did not come easily, especially for those who lived on the margins. The streets offered lessons no classroom could teach: who to trust, when to speak, and when silence was the safest option. These lessons shaped his personality long before he became a figure of authority. Detroit's underworld in the early years was chaotic and competitive. Different factions fought for territory, profits, and recognition. Violence was common, but it was also costly. Every public conflict attracted law enforcement attention, threatened income streams, and destabilized alliances. Zerilli watched all of this carefully, understood that the future belonged not to the loudest criminals, but to the most strategic ones. As prohibition faded and organized crime shifted into new ventures, Detroit became an ideal environment for quiet expansion. The city's geographic position made it a natural gateway for smuggling, particularly across the nearby Canadian border. Illegal liquor, gambling profits, and later narcotics moved efficiently through routes that required coordination rather than chaos. Zerilli's talent was organization. He saw systems where others saw opportunities for quick scores. Instead of ruling through fear, he built relationships. Instead of demanding loyalty, he earned it. His approach was simple but rare: never create unnecessary enemies, never attract unnecessary attention, and never break a deal without a reason. These principles allowed him to rise steadily while others burned out or disappeared. What made Zerilli different was his understanding of legitimacy. He knew that crime alone could not sustain long-term power. He encouraged investments that blended into everyday life, businesses that looked respectable, operations that appeared legal, and partnerships that crossed social boundaries. Money was cleaned quietly, influence was spread carefully, and the organization became deeply rooted in Detroit's economic ecosystem. While street-level operators took risks, Zerilli stayed insulated. He delegated aggressively but intelligently. Each person knew their role, and no one knew more than they needed to. This compartmentalization protected the entire structure. If one part failed, the rest survived. It was a corporate mindset applied to criminal enterprise. Law enforcement agencies struggled to understand him. There were no flashy crimes to pin directly on Zerilli. No public outbursts, no reckless behavior. Investigators suspected his influence, but suspicion was not enough. Witnesses were scarce. Evidence was indirect, and Zerilli's personal conduct was careful, controlled. He lived modestly compared to his wealth, avoided excess, and maintained a public image that did not raise alarms. Detroit's criminal world gradually stabilized under this philosophy. Violence decreased not because morality improved, but because stability benefited everyone involved. Zerilli understood that chaos invited collapse. His leadership style favored negotiation over confrontation, patience over aggression, and continuity over dominance. At the same time, he never forgot where he came from. Loyalty to family and trusted associates remained central. Betrayal was rare but handled decisively, not with spectacle, but with certainty. Word traveled quickly in criminal circles. Joseph Zerilli was not a man to challenge casually. His power was quiet, but it was absolute. This balance between invisibility and authority made him one of the most effective figures in organized crime history. He did not need to prove himself repeatedly. His reputation worked for him. Others enforced the structure he designed, often without realizing how deeply they were operating within his framework. As Detroit changed, facing economic shifts and social tension, Zerilli adapted. He avoided emotional decisions, he avoided nostalgia, he treated crime as a business, not a lifestyle. This mindset allowed him to survive decades in a world where most players lasted only a few years. Yet, beneath the calculated exterior, there was an unspoken truth. The system he helped build thrived on exploitation. It drained communities, normalized corruption, and reinforced cycles of fear and dependency. Even the most disciplined criminal enterprise carried consequences that extended far beyond its leaders. Jobs were lost, neighborhoods suffered, and trust eroded. Zerilli may have avoided public violence, but the damage of organized crime was never invisible to those living under its shadow. This story is not told to glorify crime, but to expose its mechanics. Joseph Zerilli represents a type of criminal leadership that thrives not on chaos, but on control. Understanding how such figures operate is essential to understanding why organized crime can survive for generations and why it ultimately fails. Every empire built on secrecy eventually collapses under its own weight. Power without accountability always does. The quiet rise of Joseph Zerilli teaches a critical lesson. Success achieved through manipulation and exploitation may appear stable, but it leaves no legacy worth inheriting. True strength is not measured by control over others, but by the ability to build something that does not require fear to exist. In the end, crime promises order but delivers decay. And no matter how silent the power, the cost is always paid by society. Detroit in the 1950s was a city built on rhythm factory whistles in the morning, shift changes at dusk, and neon lights flickering on after dark. Beneath that rhythm existed another pulse, slower and more deliberate, guiding money, favors, and influence through channels invisible to ordinary citizens. Joseph Zerilli understood this pulse instinctively. He did not try to overpower it. He learned how to move with it, shaping its direction without revealing his hand. As organized crime evolved after the Prohibition era, many figures struggled to redefine their purpose. Easy liquor profits were gone, and reckless violence no longer guaranteed control. Zerilli recognized early that survival depended on diversification. Gambling operations, labor racketeering, and discreet financial partnerships became the backbone of a quieter but more resilient structure. These ventures were not designed for headlines. They were designed for longevity. One of Zerilli's defining traits was patience. While others rushed expansion, he observed human behavior. He studied who kept their word under pressure, who talked too much, and who understood discretion. Trust was not granted quickly. It was tested through small responsibilities, limited exposure, and gradual access. This method created a network where loyalty was practical, not emotional. People stayed loyal because it benefited them to do so. Detroit's labor unions became a strategic frontier. Factories needed predictability, workers wanted protection, and management feared disruption. Zerilli positioned his influence where conflict could be resolved quietly. He did not insert himself publicly. Intermediaries handled negotiations. Strikes ended smoothly. Contracts moved forward. Everyone believed they had avoided disaster, unaware that the outcome had been engineered from behind closed doors. What separated Zerilli from more aggressive figures was restraint. He discouraged impulsive acts. Violence was a last resort, not a message. Every action had to serve a purpose beyond ego. This philosophy minimized internal conflict and reduced exposure to law enforcement. When disputes arose, they were settled through dialogue, compensation, or strategic compromise. Financial discipline was another cornerstone. Profits were reinvested carefully, often into legitimate-looking businesses that provided cover and stability. Restaurants, transportation companies, and real estate investments allowed money to circulate without raising suspicion. These enterprises also anchored the organization in the community, creating an illusion of normalcy that shielded deeper operations. Zerilli rarely spoke more than necessary. Meetings were brief. Instructions were precise. He believed that clarity reduced mistakes and silence reduced risk. Those who worked under him learned quickly that unnecessary questions were discouraged. Everyone understood their lane, and stepping outside it invited consequences, not dramatic ones, but definitive ones. Law enforcement pressure increased as federal agencies refined their methods. Surveillance improved, Informants became more valuable. Zerilli adapted without panic. He reduced personal exposure, delegated sensitive tasks, and maintained plausible deniability. His name appeared in conversations, but direct links were elusive. Investigators sensed his presence like a shadow, always just out of reach. The criminal ecosystem he helped shape relied on predictability. Payments arrived on time. Agreements were honored. Even rivals acknowledged his reliability. This reputation became a form of currency more valuable than cash. In a world where betrayal was common, being dependable made Zerilli indispensable. Yet, the costs of this system rippled outward. Workers manipulated through union control lost genuine representation. Businesses paid silent taxes that drained growth. Communities normalized corruption as part of daily life. The absence of violence did not equal the presence of justice. Harm wore a suit instead of a weapon. Zerilli justified his methods through order. He believed chaos was the true enemy, that structure, even criminal, was preferable to unpredictability. This belief allowed him to sleep at night, convinced that his control reduced suffering rather than caused it. But control, no matter how refined, still stripped others of choice. As the city's economy began to show early signs of strain, Zerilli prepared for transition. He anticipated change before it arrived. New revenue streams were explored quietly. Alliances were adjusted. Risk was spread. He did not cling to outdated models, understanding that rigidity led to collapse. Those who underestimated him often made the same mistake, mistaking calm for weakness. Zerilli did not react emotionally to threats or insults. He waited. Time exposed recklessness. Opportunities revealed themselves naturally. When action was required, it was decisive and final, leaving no loose ends and no public spectacle. This approach extended to succession planning. He believed organizations outlived individuals only when leadership culture was consistent. He mentored selectively, favoring those who valued discretion over bravado. The goal was continuity, not personal legacy. His name did not need to be celebrated to be effective. Despite the sophistication of his operations, the moral reality remained unchanged. Organized crime, regardless of style, thrived on manipulation. It distorted markets, corrupted institutions, and eroded trust. Zerilli's quiet dominance did not eliminate these effects, it refined them. Damage became systemic rather than visible, making it harder to confront and easier to ignore. Understanding figures like Zerilli is essential because they reveal how crime adapts. When violence fails, it evolves into influence. When fear becomes inefficient, it transforms into dependency. This is why organized crime survives long after its most notorious symbols fade away. The lesson embedded in this story is clear. Intelligence without integrity leads to exploitation. Discipline without accountability breeds corruption. Even the most orderly criminal system ultimately undermines the society it depends on. Stability built on control is not peace, it is postponement. In the end, the quiet path does not absolve wrongdoing, silence does not equal innocence, and power exercised without transparency, no matter how refined, carries consequences that echo far beyond the men who wield it. As the decades advanced, Detroit's outward image began to shift. The optimism of endless growth slowly gave way to tension, competition, and economic uncertainty. Factories that once symbolized security started showing cracks, and with uncertainty came opportunity for those who understood leverage. Joseph Zerilli operated comfortably in these transitional spaces. He believed moments of instability revealed who truly held influence, because pressure exposed weakness faster than prosperity ever could. Rather than resisting change, Zerilli anticipated it. He understood that organized crime could not remain static in a city whose economic foundations were evolving. His strategy relied on adaptability, not tradition. Where others clung to outdated methods, he studied trends: declining manufacturing output, rising unemployment, shifting demographics, and increased federal attention. These were not threats to him, they were signals. One of his most effective techniques was indirect control. He rarely placed himself at the center of transactions. Instead, he empowered intermediaries who appeared independent but operated within clearly defined boundaries. These figures interacted with business owners, labor representatives, and local power brokers, creating layers that insulated Zerilli from direct exposure. Influence traveled downward, responsibility flowed upward, and accountability stopped before reaching the top. Money management became increasingly sophisticated. Cash-heavy operations were structured to blend seamlessly into legitimate economic activity. Profits were broken into smaller streams, routed through businesses that matched their financial profiles, and reinvested in assets that appreciated quietly over time. Zerilli believed visibility was risk. The goal was not to look rich, but to be untouchable. Trust within the organization was maintained through predictability. Zerilli discouraged emotional loyalty and favored rational alignment. Those who worked with him understood the rules clearly, follow instructions, respect boundaries, and never attract attention. Rewards were consistent, consequences were inevitable, and favoritism was rare. This created an environment where ambition existed but recklessness was self-limiting. As law enforcement refined investigative techniques, Zerilli adjusted his behavior accordingly. He reduced in-person meetings, limited phone usage, and relied on trusted couriers when communication was unavoidable. He avoided patterns, understanding that repetition created vulnerability. His routines appeared ordinary, even boring, which was precisely the point. The absence of chaos within his operations created an illusion of harmlessness. Violence was minimal, disputes were managed quietly, and public disturbances were avoided. To the untrained eye, it seemed as though organized crime had lost its edge. In reality, it had matured. Harm became less visible but more deeply embedded in systems that affected everyday life. Small business owners learned that cooperation was easier than resistance. Union members noticed decisions being made without their input. Local officials found certain problems resolving themselves before they escalated. These conveniences masked a deeper erosion of autonomy. When outcomes are predetermined, choice becomes ceremonial. Zerilli justified his approach as pragmatic. He believed the city benefited from stability, even if that stability came at a hidden cost. He convinced himself that he prevented greater violence by maintaining order. This rationalization is common among those who operate in moral gray zones. Efficiency becomes a substitute for ethics, and control is mistaken for responsibility. Internally, dissent was rare but instructive. When individuals challenged decisions or acted independently, the response was calm but firm. Zerilli did not overreact. He allowed mistakes to reveal intent. Those who threatened the structure through ego or carelessness were removed from influence without drama. The message was clear: the system mattered more than any individual. As Detroit's challenges deepened, community impact became more pronounced. Neighborhoods struggled, employment opportunities shrank, and frustration grew. Organized crime fed on this environment by offering alternatives, illegal income streams, protection, and access to power. Zerilli understood that desperation made people compliant. He did not create these conditions, but he did not hesitate to use them. Despite his careful methods, the long-term consequences were unavoidable. Systems built on manipulation eventually weaken the institutions they depend on. Businesses operating under coercion stagnate. Labor movement, compromised by outside influence, lose credibility. Communities accustomed to corruption stop believing in fairness. These effects accumulate slowly, making them harder to confront but more damaging over time. Zerilli's leadership style discouraged flamboyance. He avoided luxury that invited scrutiny. His personal life appeared modest, reinforcing the perception that he was removed from criminal excess. This separation between image and reality was deliberate. The less people associated him with crime, the more effectively he could influence it. His legacy within the criminal world was one of respect rather than fear. Rivals acknowledged his intelligence. Allies trusted his judgment. Even opponents recognized that he honored agreements. In an environment defined by betrayal, consistency became his strongest weapon. Yet, consistency without morality still leads to harm. Zerilli's story illustrates how crime can integrate itself into everyday life without obvious signs. When wrongdoing becomes procedural, it stops feeling wrong to those who benefit from it. This normalization is one of the most dangerous aspects of organized crime. The educational value of this narrative lies in recognition. Crime does not always announce itself through violence. Sometimes it arrives through paperwork, negotiations, and quiet understandings. Understanding this evolution is essential for preventing it. Awareness disrupts complacency and transparency weakens hidden power. As time moved forward, Zerilli remained vigilant. He trusted data more than instinct. patterns more than promises. He knew that complacency was the enemy of survival. His continued relevance depended on staying invisible while remaining indispensable. In the end, the calm surface he maintained concealed a system that drained more than it created. Stability achieved through control is temporary. Influence exercised without accountability eventually collapses under scrutiny, no matter how refined the structure. Crime leaves behind fractures that take generations to repair. The deeper lesson is clear. True progress requires transparency, fairness, and lawful opportunity. When shortcuts replace integrity, society pays the price later, often with interest. Power that thrives in silence is still power misused, and its consequences never remain silent forever. By the time Detroit's social and economic pressures intensified, the city had become a testing ground for resilience. Declining industries, rising unemployment, and shifting political priorities created gaps in authority spaces where unofficial power could thrive. Joseph Zerilli understood that influence expanded fastest not during times of strength, but during moments of uncertainty. His strategy was never to compete with institutions openly, but to position himself where institutions quietly failed. As legitimate systems struggled to keep pace with rapid change, Zerilli refined his ability to operate parallel to them. He did not challenge the law directly. Instead, he exploited inefficiencies. When bureaucracy slowed progress, he offered speed. When negotiations stalled, he offered resolution. When fear paralyzed decision-making, he offered certainty. These services came at a cost, but the cost was rarely discussed openly. The criminal network under his guidance became more disciplined as the environment grew harsher. Rules were reinforced. Communication tightened. Exposure was reduced. Zerilli insisted that every action be evaluated for risk versus reward. Emotional decisions were discouraged. Impulse was treated as liability. In this system, intelligence mattered more than aggression, and discipline mattered more than reputation. A defining feature of his leadership was consistency. He believed unpredictability destroyed trust, and trust was the foundation of control. Associates knew what to expect from him, which reduced anxiety and prevented internal conflict. This predictability extended to financial arrangements, conflict resolution, and responses to mistakes. The organization functioned like a machine designed to minimize friction. Zerilli's understanding of human psychology allowed him to manage people without micromanagement. He recognized that most individuals were motivated by security rather than ambition. By providing steady income and protection, he reduced the desire for rebellion. Those who sought more power were observed carefully. Advancement was slow and deliberate, ensuring loyalty developed before authority. As scrutiny increased at higher levels of government, Zerilli leaned further into insulation. He reduced his visible footprint, delegating operational authority while maintaining strategic oversight. This separation protected him from direct association with illegal acts while preserving his influence over outcomes. His presence was felt more than it was seen. The absence of overt violence became a strategic advantage. Public disturbances attracted attention, and attention threatened stability. Zerilli viewed violence as failure, a sign that negotiation, planning, or discipline had broken down. When force was unavoidable, it was controlled and contained, leaving no spectacle behind. Community perception played a subtle role in his longevity. Zerilli avoided antagonizing neighborhoods unnecessarily. He understood that widespread resentment created risk. By maintaining a low profile and avoiding indiscriminate harm, he reduced the likelihood of cooperation with authorities. Silence, in this context, became a form of protection. Yet, beneath this calm exterior, the damage continued. Businesses operated under invisible pressure. Workers lost genuine bargaining power. Opportunities were distorted by favoritism and fear. Zerilli's system did not collapse communities overnight. It slowly reshaped them, normalizing compromise and eroding trust in lawful processes. His internal code emphasized loyalty but rejected sentimentality. Personal relationships were secondary to organizational survival. Decisions were made with long-term stability in mind, even when they caused short-term discomfort. This mindset created a culture where individuals were valued for their utility, not their humanity. As economic decline deepened, desperation increased. Zerilli recognized that scarcity made people more willing to accept risk. Illegal ventures expanded quietly, absorbing those pushed out of legitimate employment. This cycle reinforced dependence on criminal structures, making withdrawal increasingly difficult for participants. Despite his calculated approach, Zerilli was not immune to pressure. Maintaining control required constant vigilance. He monitored shifts in alliances, tracked emerging threats, and adjusted strategy accordingly. Complacency was the enemy. He understood that power, once taken for granted, was already slipping away. His adaptability extended to generational change. Younger participants brought different expectations and risks. Zerilli responded by reinforcing discipline and limiting exposure. He believed that modernization required caution, not enthusiasm. Technology and speed increased efficiency, but also increased traceability. Every advancement carried new vulnerabilities. The moral contradiction at the heart of his leadership became more pronounced over time. Zerilli believed he was preventing chaos, yet his influence undermined legitimate systems designed to protect the public. This paradox allowed him to rationalize harm as necessity, or to replace justice as the measure of success. Understanding this contradiction is critical. Organized crime often presents itself as a solution to disorder, but it creates dependency rather than empowerment. Stability achieved through coercion is fragile. It survives only as long as fear or convenience outweighs resistance. Zerilli's restraint delayed confrontation, but did not eliminate it. Systems built on secrecy eventually face exposure. Institutions weakened by corruption eventually collapse under scrutiny. The longer injustice operates quietly, the more severe the reckoning becomes. This chapter of the story serves as a warning rather than a tribute. Intelligence without ethics leads to exploitation. Control without accountability leads to decay. Even the most refined criminal structure cannot escape the consequences of undermining trust. True leadership strengthens institutions rather than replacing them. It creates opportunity without coercion and order without fear. When power operates in silence, society must listen more carefully, not less. The lesson is simple but profound. Stability gained through wrongdoing is temporary, and influence built on manipulation leaves nothing lasting behind. Only transparency, responsibility, and lawful opportunity can create progress that endures. As the years moved forward, the environment surrounding Detroit grew more complex and less predictable. Economic decline was no longer a distant threat. It was an everyday reality. Neighborhoods that once thrived on steady industrial wages began to fracture, and with that fracture came uncertainty, frustration, and opportunity. Joseph Zerilli understood that power during decline required a different kind of discipline than power during growth. Expansion was no longer the goal. Preservation was. Zerilli shifted his focus from growth to consolidation. He believed that overextension was the most common cause of collapse in criminal organizations. Rather than chasing new territory aggressively, he reinforced existing structures. Profitable operations were protected, inefficient ones were quietly shut down, and unnecessary exposure was eliminated. Every decision was filtered through a single question: does this strengthen the system or weaken it? One of his most effective tools during this period was discretion. Zerilli avoided emotional reactions to setbacks. Losses were absorbed without retaliation unless absolutely necessary. This approach frustrated rivals who expected escalation. By refusing to engage in public conflict, he denied them the visibility they sought and preserved his own stability. Financial management became even more conservative. Cash reserves were maintained to withstand disruption. Investments favored assets that could survive economic turbulence. Zerilli understood that liquidity meant flexibility, and flexibility meant survival. The organization's financial structure mirrored that of a cautious corporation rather than a reckless street operation. Internal discipline tightened further. Zerilli emphasized personal conduct, reminding associates that careless behavior threatened everyone. Excess spending, public displays of wealth, and reckless talk were discouraged. The goal was to blend into the background, to appear unremarkable. Invisibility became a form of armor. As pressure increased from authorities and competitors alike, Zerilli relied more heavily on reputation than force. His history of reliability continued to protect him. Agreements were honored, disputes were resolved calmly, and his word carried weight. In an unstable environment, consistency became a rare and valuable commodity. However, consistency came at a human cost. Individuals within the organization found it increasingly difficult to leave. Dependence replaced choice. Illegal income filled gaps left by legitimate opportunities, trapping participants in cycles that offered short-term relief but long-term risk. Zerilli recognized this dynamic but did not intervene. Dependency strengthened control. Community impact deepened. Corruption, once subtle, became normalized. People adjusted expectations downward, accepting compromise as inevitable. This erosion of standards did not occur overnight. It happened gradually, through repeated exposure to systems that rewarded compliance over integrity. Zerilli justified his actions through pragmatism. He believed that the city's decline was inevitable and that his structure provided stability where none existed. This belief allowed him to frame exploitation as service. Yet, service without consent is still coercion, no matter how orderly it appears. As generational change accelerated, Zerilli faced new challenges. Younger participants lacked patience and discipline. They were drawn to speed and visibility, traits that threatened the careful balance he had maintained. Zerilli responded by limiting their access and reinforcing hierarchy. Advancement slowed, and trust was earned through restraint rather than ambition. This created tension, but Zerilli accepted it as necessary. He believed that survival required resisting the temptation to modernize recklessly. Technology increased reach but also left trails. Faster communication reduced deliberation. He preferred control over convenience. Despite his caution, risk was unavoidable. External pressures continued to mount. Investigative techniques improved. Financial oversight increased. Zerilli adapted by further distancing himself from operations, reinforcing layers between decision-making and execution. His role became increasingly abstract, focused on strategy rather than action. This abstraction reinforced his authority while isolating him from consequences. The further removed he became, the easier it was to rationalize harm. Numbers replaced faces. Outcomes replaced experiences. This psychological distance is a common feature among long-term power holders, criminal or otherwise. The broader lesson emerges clearly during this phase. Crime does not always collapse dramatically. Often it erodes slowly, taking trust and opportunity with it. Zerilli's system survived by becoming less visible, not less harmful. Stability masked stagnation. Order concealed exploitation. Understanding this pattern is essential for prevention. When communities lose faith in legitimate systems, alternatives legal or not fill the void. Restoring trust requires transparency, accountability, and genuine opportunity. Without these, hidden power thrives. Zerilli's discipline delayed reckoning but did not eliminate it. No system built on coercion can adapt indefinitely. Each adjustment creates new vulnerabilities. Each layer of insulation increases complexity. Eventually, complexity becomes fragility. The motivation behind this story is not fascination, but awareness. Intelligence and restraint do not justify wrongdoing. Control does not equal leadership. Influence exercised without responsibility corrodes both the wielder and the environment it touches. True resilience comes from empowering communities, not controlling them. Progress comes from lawful opportunity, not hidden leverage. The quiet path of crime may appear efficient, but its costs are always paid later, often by those with the least ability to recover. In the end, the most enduring lesson is simple. Stability built on fear, dependency, or manipulation cannot last. Only systems rooted in fairness, transparency, and accountability create outcomes worth sustaining. Power fades, but the damage it leaves behind remains long after the silence is broken. As time progressed, the structure surrounding Joseph Zerilli became less about expansion and more about endurance. The environment was no longer forgiving. Every decision carried weight, and every misstep risked exposure. Zerilli understood that longevity in an unforgiving landscape required not only intelligence but restraint reinforced by experience. He was no longer simply managing operations, he was managing decline without collapse. The criminal ecosystem around him had matured into something quieter and more bureaucratic. Informality disappeared, replaced by procedures and routines designed to reduce unpredictability. Zerilli believed that systems outlast individuals, and his focus shifted toward preserving function rather than asserting authority. Leadership, in his view, was no longer about direction, it was about stabilization. He became increasingly selective about involvement. Direct engagement was rare. Strategic oversight replaced operational control. This separation allowed him to observe patterns rather than events. He watched how pressure moved through the system, how stress revealed weak points, and how loyalty shifted under strain. These observations informed subtle adjustments that kept the structure intact. One of Zerilli's most deliberate choices during this period was limiting growth. He believed that ambition was the greatest threat to stability. Rapid expansion invited attention, created management gaps, and attracted participants who valued speed over discretion. By keeping operations contained, he reduced exposure and maintained discipline. Financial caution remained central. Zerilli emphasized sustainability over profit maximization. He understood that aggressive accumulation created risk. Cash flow was managed conservatively and reserves were prioritized. The goal was not dominance, but resilience. Surviving disruption mattered more than outperforming rivals. Internal communication became increasingly controlled. Information was shared on a need-to-know basis. Redundancy was avoided. Zerilli believed that silence was safer than explanation. The fewer people who understood the full picture, the fewer vulnerabilities existed. This approach created efficiency, but it also increased dependency on centralized decision-making. As outside scrutiny intensified, Zerilli adapted his personal behavior further. He maintained routine, avoided conspicuous patterns, and minimized social exposure. Normalcy became camouflage. He understood that appearing unremarkable was the most effective defense against suspicion. Despite these precautions, stress accumulated within the organization. Participants faced heightened risk with diminishing reward. Fear increased, patience declined, and loyalty was tested. Zerilli addressed these pressures through predictability rather than reassurance. Consistency replaced comfort. He believed clarity reduced panic. This environment revealed a moral emptiness at the core of long-term criminal leadership. Survival demanded emotional distance. Compassion became impractical. Decisions were judged solely on outcome, not impact. Zerilli had mastered this detachment, but mastery came at a cost. Isolation deepened, and humanity narrowed to calculation. The community consequences became harder to ignore. Long-term manipulation distorted opportunity. Younger generations inherited fewer choices. Normalized corruption eroded faith in fairness. These outcomes were not accidental. They were systemic. Zerilli's structure did not create decline, but it thrived within it, reinforcing cycles that were difficult to break. From an educational perspective, this phase demonstrates how crime embeds itself through endurance rather than aggression. When systems adapt faster than oversight, wrongdoing becomes routine. The absence of visible conflict creates the illusion of resolution, masking deeper damage. Zerilli rationalized endurance as responsibility. He believed that maintaining order prevented chaos. This belief allowed him to frame control as protection. Yet protection without consent remains coercion. Stability achieved through manipulation is not peace, it is suppression. As leadership aged, succession became an unspoken concern. Zerilli understood that continuity depended on culture rather than personality. He reinforced values of discretion, patience, and restraint. However, cultural transmission weakened as external pressures intensified. Fear replaced discipline. Survival replaced strategy. This shift marked a subtle turning point. Systems built on control require constant reinforcement. When reinforcement weakens, compliance erodes. Zerilli sensed this vulnerability and responded by tightening oversight. But tightening created strain, and strain accelerated fatigue. The paradox of long-term power became clear. The more effort required to maintain control, the less sustainable it became. Every adjustment reduced flexibility. Every safeguard added complexity. Eventually, complexity became fragility. The lesson embedded here is critical. Crime does not fail because it lacks intelligence. It fails because it lacks legitimacy. No amount of discipline can replace trust freely given. No structure built on fear can adapt indefinitely. Zerilli's endurance was impressive, but endurance alone is not success. Success is measured by what remains after power fades. In this case, what remained was a weakened community and distorted systems struggling to recover. The motivational truth is unavoidable. True strength lies in building institutions that do not depend on secrecy or coercion. Leadership that empowers others creates resilience. Leadership that controls others creates dependence. This story is not about admiration, but understanding. Quiet power may last longer than loud violence, but it still collapses under its own contradictions. The silence that protects it eventually becomes the evidence that condemns it. In the end, the cost of endurance without ethics is isolation. Power shrinks as it concentrates, and control becomes a burden rather than a privilege. What appears stable from the outside often hides decay within. By this stage, the world surrounding Joseph Zerilli had grown quieter, but the quiet carried weight. It was not the calm of peace, but the stillness that follows long pressure. Detroit itself reflected this tension: less noise, fewer promises, and a sense that something fundamental had shifted. Zerilli understood that silence could mean stability, but it could also signal exhaustion. Knowing the difference became essential. The structure he maintained relied heavily on memory and habit. People did things a certain way because they always had. This continuity had once been a strength, but over time it hardened into rigidity. Zerilli recognized this risk and attempted to balance tradition with adaptation. Change, he believed, had to be gradual to avoid fracture. Control became increasingly symbolic. Zerilli no longer needed to issue frequent directives. His reputation alone guided behavior. This indirect authority reduced exposure but increased dependence on perception. As long as people believed he was in control, the system held. The danger lay in doubt. Once confidence wavered, compliance followed. He monitored subtle indicators: hesitation in communication, delays in response, small deviations from routine. These were early warning signs. Zerilli addressed them with precision, reinforcing expectations without confrontation. He believed that correction worked best when it was quiet and immediate. Despite his vigilance, external pressure continued to intensify. Oversight tightened. Margins narrowed. The room for error shrank. Zerilli responded by simplifying wherever possible. Complexity, once a shield, became a liability. Fewer operations meant fewer risks. Less movement meant fewer mistakes. This contraction required sacrifice. Profitable ventures were abandoned if they increased exposure. Relationships were loosened. Influence retreated from areas that could not be controlled discreetly. Zerilli accepted reduced reach in exchange for survival. Power, in his view, was only valuable if it could be maintained. Internally, morale suffered. Participants accustomed to growth struggled with restraint. Opportunity felt limited. Fear replaced ambition. Zerilli did not attempt to inspire, he enforced discipline. Motivation through vision was replaced by motivation through consequence. This kept the structure intact but hollowed it from within. The emotional distance that had once protected Zerilli now isolated him. Trust became transactional. Relationships were evaluated for risk rather than loyalty. This detachment made decision-making efficient but stripped it of empathy. The human cost became abstract, easier to ignore but impossible to erase. Community impact continued to ripple outward. Long-term manipulation left scars: businesses weakened, workers disillusioned, and neighborhoods resigned to limited options. Zerilli's system did not create these problems alone, but it exploited them effectively. Exploitation, once normalized, becomes invisible to those benefiting from it. Zerilli justified contraction as responsibility. He believed that reducing activity minimized harm. Yet harm does not disappear when activity slows. It lingers in systems already distorted. Stability without restoration is incomplete. Order without repair is temporary. The educational insight here is crucial. Crime adapts not only through expansion but through retreat. When pressure increases, it sheds visibility. This makes detection harder and consequences slower, but the underlying damage persists. Zerilli's leadership during this phase emphasized endurance over innovation. He resisted change that threatened control, even when adaptation might have offered renewal. This conservatism preserved stability but accelerated stagnation. Survival became the only metric of success. As the structure aged, generational disconnect widened. New participants lacked historical context. Old participants lacked energy. Zerilli attempted to bridge this gap through rules rather than mentorship. Rules maintain order but cannot transmit purpose. This absence of purpose revealed a deeper truth. Systems built on control rarely inspire loyalty beyond self-interest. When risk outweighs reward, commitment fades. Zerilli sensed this erosion and responded with tighter oversight, but oversight without trust breeds resentment. The paradox of long-term control became undeniable. The more effort required to maintain authority, the less authority truly existed. Power shifted from influence to enforcement. Compliance replaced cooperation. The moral lesson emerges clearly. Quiet domination avoids spectacle but not consequence. Control exercised without legitimacy slowly poisons the environment it depends on. Over time, even the controller becomes trapped by the system they created. From a motivational standpoint, this phase underscores the value of lawful structure. Institutions that rely on transparency and consent can adapt without coercion. Those built on secrecy must constantly defend themselves against exposure. Zerilli's silence, once strategic, became burdensome. Information flow narrowed. Awareness diminished. Isolation increased risk. The shield that protected him also limited his ability to respond effectively to change. In the end, the quiet did not mean victory. It meant endurance under strain. Survival without growth is not success, it is postponement. The costs continue to accumulate, unseen but undeniable. The lesson for the audience is direct. Power gained through manipulation eventually demands more than it gives. Stability built on fear cannot renew itself. True strength lies in systems that empower people rather than control them. This story does not celebrate restraint in crime, it exposes its limits. Silence may delay consequences, but it cannot prevent them. When accountability is absent, collapse is only a matter of time. By this point, the landscape surrounding Joseph Zerilli had transformed into something fragile and tightly wound. The era of quiet expansion had long passed, replaced by an atmosphere where caution dominated every decision. What remained was not an empire in motion, but a system holding its breath. Zerilli understood that survival now depended less on strategy and more on restraint refined to its limit. He shifted his attention toward minimizing risk at every level. The guiding principle became reduction: fewer interactions, fewer dependencies, fewer variables that could spiral beyond control. Zerilli believed that when pressure peaks, subtraction is safer than addition. Every removed element lowered the chance of exposure. Authority during this phase was exercised through expectation rather than instruction. Zerilli rarely needed to speak. His silence itself carried direction. People adjusted behavior instinctively, guided by an understanding of what would be tolerated and what would not. This created efficiency, but it also created fear. Fear is effective in the short term, but corrosive over time. Operational roles narrowed. Participants were confined to tightly defined tasks, limiting their knowledge and influence. This compartmentalization reduced vulnerability, but also weakened initiative. Creativity was replaced by compliance. Zerilli accepted this trade-off, valuing predictability over innovation. Financial activity followed the same pattern. Transactions were smaller, slower, and more deliberate. Aggressive profit-taking was discouraged. Zerilli understood that visibility, not illegality, attracted attention. By reducing scale, he aimed to blend into the background of everyday economic noise. This approach succeeded in delaying confrontation, but it carried hidden costs. Reduced opportunity increased dissatisfaction. Participants felt trapped between risk and stagnation. Zerilli addressed unrest through discipline rather than dialogue. He believed that discussion created uncertainty, and uncertainty created mistakes. Isolation deepened. Zerilli's circle of trust shrank as exposure increased. Fewer voices reached him, limiting perspective. Information became filtered, shaped by fear of consequences. This insulation protected him from immediate threats, but increased long-term vulnerability. Decisions made without full context tend to age poorly. The environment outside the organization continued to deteriorate. Communities struggled with reduced opportunity and declining trust in institutions. Organized crime did not appear as a solution anymore. It appeared as a symptom. Zerilli recognized the shift, but did not attempt reform. His system was built to operate within dysfunction, not to correct it. The psychological toll of long-term control became evident. Constant vigilance narrowed focus. Empathy faded. Zerilli's worldview contracted to risk management. Moral considerations became abstract, secondary to survival. This detachment allowed efficiency, but it eroded meaning. Despite his discipline, uncertainty persisted. External forces remained unpredictable. Zerilli adapted by reinforcing routine. Routine reduced anxiety and maintained order. However, routine also masked decay. When systems rely on habit alone, they lose the ability to respond creatively to change. This phase highlights a critical insight into organized crime. Longevity does not equal success. Surviving under pressure often means sacrificing purpose, growth, and humanity. What remains is a mechanism focused solely on avoiding collapse. Zerilli justified this existence as necessary. He believed that maintaining structure prevented greater harm. Yet structure without legitimacy only postpones harm. The damage accumulates quietly, spreading through systems that appear stable on the surface. The educational value here lies in recognizing stagnation as a warning sign. When power no longer produces opportunity, it becomes extractive. When control replaces collaboration, decay accelerates. These patterns apply beyond crime, offering lessons for any system built on authority without accountability. Zerilli's restraint delayed consequences but intensified dependency. Participants relied on the structure for stability, even as it limited their futures. This dependency reinforced control but weakened resilience. Systems that cannot release people freely are already failing. As time continued, the question was no longer how to expand or dominate, but how long endurance could be maintained. Zerilli sensed the limits approaching. The silence he cultivated began to feel heavy, not protective. Awareness narrowed, options diminished, and every decision felt reactive rather than strategic. This is the quiet endgame of hidden power. Not collapse, but exhaustion. Not exposure, but erosion. The system does not fall apart dramatically. It thins until it can no longer support itself. The moral lesson becomes unavoidable. Control without consent drains both sides. Power exercised solely to preserve itself loses purpose. Influence that fears transparency has already admitted its weakness. From a motivational perspective, this chapter emphasizes the value of openness and adaptability. Systems thrive when people participate willingly, not when they comply silently. Progress requires trust, not fear. Zerilli's journey demonstrates that intelligence and restraint can delay failure, but they cannot redeem injustice. Stability achieved through secrecy cannot renew itself. Eventually, silence stops being a shield and becomes a signal. In the end, endurance without meaning is not victory. It is survival stripped of purpose. True strength lies not in how long power lasts, but in what it builds while it exists. As time moved forward, the environment around Joseph Zerilli entered a phase where survival was no longer strategic, it was psychological. The systems that once responded predictably now required constant reassurance. Stability had become fragile, maintained through routine rather than confidence. Zerilli understood that when a structure reaches this stage, its greatest threat is not exposure, but internal erosion. He responded by reinforcing boundaries. Access narrowed further. Communication became minimal and deliberate. Zerilli believed that clarity was safer than comfort. He preferred short, precise exchanges over explanations that could be misinterpreted or repeated. In a world where words carried risk, silence was control. Authority during this phase depended almost entirely on memory. People remembered how things had been and assumed they would continue. Zerilli relied on this assumption, knowing that belief often outlasts reality. As long as participants believed the structure remained intact, they behaved accordingly. Yet belief is fragile. Doubt grows quietly. Zerilli monitored morale indirectly, watching for changes in behavior rather than listening to complaints. Hesitation, delay, and avoidance were signals. He addressed these signs through enforcement, reinforcing consequences rather than addressing causes. This approach maintained order but weakened loyalty. Participants complied because they had to, not because they wanted to. Fear replaced alignment. Zerilli accepted this trade-off, convinced that loyalty was a luxury under pressure. Financial management became increasingly defensive. Cash flow was stabilized, not expanded. Risky ventures were eliminated. Zerilli aimed to preserve what remained rather than pursue what might be gained. This conservative posture reduced exposure but also reduced opportunity, accelerating stagnation. The emotional cost of long-term vigilance became more pronounced. Zerilli's world narrowed to a set of risks and responses. Empathy faded into abstraction. Decisions were evaluated solely on whether they reduced threat. This detachment protected him from hesitation but isolated him further. Community impact remained significant. Long-standing manipulation left lasting effects, limited opportunity, distorted markets, and eroded trust. Zerilli's structure functioned like a shadow economy, filling gaps while deepening dependency. This dependency ensured compliance but weakened resilience. The educational lesson here is subtle but critical. Crime does not always collapse because it is defeated. It often collapses because it exhausts itself. Systems built on fear and secrecy consume energy constantly. Eventually, there is not enough left to sustain them. Zerilli's silence became heavier. Information flow slowed. Awareness diminished. The insulation that once protected him now limited his ability to adapt. Decisions were made with incomplete data, increasing risk despite caution. This phase reveals a paradox of control. The more tightly power is held, the less flexible it becomes. Adaptation requires openness. Secrecy resists adaptation. Zerilli understood this conflict, but chose caution over change. From a motivational standpoint, this illustrates why lawful systems matter. Transparency allows correction. Accountability allows renewal. Hidden power avoids correction until failure becomes unavoidable. Zerilli justified endurance as responsibility. He believed that holding the structure together prevented chaos. Yet chaos does not disappear when order is enforced artificially. It accumulates beneath the surface, waiting for release. As time continued, the structure relied increasingly on habit rather than intention. People followed routines because questioning them felt dangerous. Routine maintained order but masked decay. Without reflection, systems drift toward irrelevance. The human element became secondary. Individuals were managed as variables rather than people. Zerilli accepted this abstraction, believing it necessary for survival. But abstraction erodes judgment. When consequences feel distant, decisions lose moral weight. This stage of the story emphasizes the cost of prolonged control. Power that cannot evolve becomes brittle. Stability without growth leads to fatigue. Endurance without purpose leads to collapse. Zerilli's experience offers a cautionary lesson. Intelligence and restraint can delay consequences, but they cannot erase them. The longer injustice operates quietly, the harder it becomes to correct. The motivational truth is clear. Sustainable leadership requires trust, participation, and accountability. Systems that rely on fear and secrecy may last for a time, but they leave behind damage that takes generations to repair. In the end, the silence surrounding Zerilli's world was not peace. It was tension held in place. When silence becomes heavy, it signals that resolution is overdue. By this stage, the structure surrounding Joseph Zerilli had reached a point where endurance depended more on habit than intention. What once felt calculated now felt automatic. Decisions were no longer about shaping the future, but about preventing sudden failure. Zerilli recognized this shift with clarity, even if he did not openly acknowledge it. The system had stopped growing and started aging. Aging systems behave differently. They resist change, rely on memory, and punish deviation. Zerilli adapted his leadership accordingly. He reduced flexibility, believing that rigid boundaries would prevent mistakes. Innovation was treated as risk. Predictability became the highest value. This approach preserved short-term stability but slowly drained adaptability. Authority now functioned through assumption. People acted as though Zerilli's control was absolute, because it always had been. He allowed this belief to persist, understanding that perception often matters more than reality. However, perception requires reinforcement. When reinforcement weakens, belief erodes. To counter this, Zerilli reinforced discipline quietly. Expectations were clarified. Deviations were corrected swiftly. He avoided dramatic responses, preferring subtle adjustments that restored order without drawing attention. This quiet enforcement maintained compliance, but it did not restore confidence. The emotional landscape of the organization had changed. Fear was no longer sharp. It was dull and constant. Participants operated cautiously, avoiding initiative. Zerilli noticed the decline in energy but accepted it as the cost of survival. Momentum had been replaced by inertia. Financial operations mirrored this stagnation. Profit margins narrowed. Risk tolerance declined. Zerilli focused on preserving liquidity rather than pursuing opportunity. This conservative posture reduced exposure but also reduced relevance. Systems that stopped creating value began extracting it instead. The psychological toll of long-term vigilance became unavoidable. Zerilli's focus narrowed further. He trusted fewer people. Information traveled slowly and selectively. This insulation protected him from immediate threats but limited his ability to anticipate change. Awareness shrank as control tightened. The surrounding environment continued to evolve without regard for his structure. Economic conditions shifted. Oversight increased. Social expectations changed. Zerilli responded by doubling down on routine, believing that consistency would outlast uncertainty. Routine, however, cannot solve problems it refuses to acknowledge. The moral cost of this approach deepened. Long-standing manipulation had normalized compromise. Communities affected by hidden control lost faith in fairness. Zerilli's system did not collapse dramatically. It lingered, draining opportunity quietly. Harm became systemic rather than visible. This phase illustrates a critical lesson about power. When authority exists only to preserve itself, it loses legitimacy. Control without purpose becomes maintenance for its own sake. Zerilli's leadership, once strategic, had become custodial. Internally, dissatisfaction increased. Participants felt constrained by rules that offered diminishing reward. Zerilli addressed this through enforcement rather than engagement. He believed dialogue invited instability. Yet silence does not resolve tension, it only postpones expression. As isolation increased, Zerilli's decision-making became more abstract. He evaluated outcomes without direct exposure to their impact. This distance simplified choices but reduced empathy. Efficiency replaced judgment. Over time, this detachment weakened strategic insight. The educational value here lies in recognizing stagnation as a form of decline. Systems do not need to collapse violently to fail. They can wither, becoming irrelevant while appearing intact. Zerilli's structure remained functional, but its purpose had narrowed to survival alone. From a motivational perspective, this chapter reinforces the importance of renewal. Sustainable systems evolve through transparency and accountability. They invite participation rather than enforce compliance. When renewal is resisted, decline accelerates. Zerilli justified endurance as responsibility. He believed that holding the structure together prevented chaos. Yet chaos does not disappear when suppressed, it accumulates pressure. Suppression without resolution guarantees eventual rupture. The paradox of control became undeniable. The more effort required to maintain order, the less order truly existed. Power shifted from influence to enforcement. Compliance replaced cooperation. Fear replaced trust. This stage of the story underscores a universal truth. Intelligence and restraint can delay failure, but they cannot replace legitimacy. Systems built on secrecy cannot correct themselves. Without accountability, mistakes compound. Zerilli's silence, once protective, became limiting. Information gaps widened. Adaptation slowed. The shield he relied on now obscured emerging risks. When awareness declines, even cautious systems stumble. The lesson for the audience is direct and practical. Leadership without accountability eventually isolates itself. Stability without justice cannot renew. Control without consent cannot endure. In the end, the quiet persistence of Zerilli's world was not strength. It was postponement. Survival without growth is not success. It is decline in slow motion. True power builds opportunity. It strengthens institutions rather than replacing them. It leaves behind systems that function without fear. Anything less may last for a time, but it cannot last forever. By this point, the landscape surrounding Joseph Zerilli had shifted into a delicate balance of endurance and risk. Detroit itself had become a city of contradictions. Industry struggled, communities adapted to scarcity, and power often operated invisibly. Zerilli's influence remained, but it was no longer an aggressive force. It was a stabilizing current, subtle yet persistent. His mastery was not in expansion anymore, but in preserving a fragile equilibrium. Zerilli approached leadership with an almost surgical precision. Every decision was measured, every action calculated, and every communication weighed against potential exposure. He had learned that missteps, however minor, could ripple unpredictably through a complex web of relationships. This meticulous approach kept his organization intact even as external pressures increased. Yet, it came with a cost. Rigidity replaced flexibility and caution replaced initiative. Internal discipline became the backbone of his operation. Zerilli enforced routines that minimized deviation. Financial records were meticulous, transactions compartmentalized, and responsibilities clearly defined. Each associate understood the boundaries of authority, the limits of acceptable behavior, and the consequences of missteps. These rules were not arbitrary, they were survival mechanisms. Compliance was not requested, it was expected. Financial prudence was now a central feature of Zerilli's strategy. Aggressive ventures were abandoned in favor of slow, sustainable growth. Cash flow was managed conservatively, and investments were selected for their stability rather than their potential for rapid return. This cautious approach reduced risk exposure and reinforced the perception of order. The system did not aim to dominate, it aimed to persist. Zerilli's communication style reflected this mindset. He rarely spoke more than necessary, preferring clarity over verbosity. Instructions were concise, often delivered indirectly through trusted intermediaries. By limiting discussion, he reduced the potential for leaks, misunderstandings, or betrayal. Silence became both a tool and a shield, protecting him while maintaining authority. Yet, the human cost of this disciplined approach was significant. Emotional distance, once protective, now limited connection. Associate, implied out of necessity rather than loyalty. Fear replaced inspiration. Motivation came from consequence rather than opportunity. Zerilli accepted this trade-off, believing it essential for the preservation of the organization. But he was aware that such structures could not sustain passion or creativity. Externally, the city continued to challenge his influence. Economic decline, shifting political priorities, and social unrest created unpredictable variables. Zerilli responded not by confrontation but by subtle adjustment. He maintained visibility only where necessary and relied on reputation to influence outcomes. People acted as though he was omnipresent, though he often remained distant, allowing the perception of control to function as a tool in itself. Community impact during this phase became increasingly evident. The structures Zerilli maintained operated efficiently, but their effect on ordinary citizens was less benign. Businesses were constrained by implicit control, workers experienced limited bargaining power, and opportunities were filtered through the lens of influence rather than merit. Stability was achieved, but autonomy was diminished. The psychological toll on Zerilli mirrored the tension he imposed on others. Long-term vigilance required constant monitoring of both people and events. The pressure to remain unseen while influential demanded focus, patience, and emotional detachment. Over time, even minor deviations felt like potential crises. Every decision was shadowed by the awareness that mistakes could have consequences far beyond the immediate moment. Zerilli's ability to navigate this environment relied heavily on pattern recognition. He anticipated human behavior, financial fluctuations, and the moves of rivals and authorities alike. Anticipation replaced reaction. Forethought replaced improvisation. In a world of limited trust and hidden risks, the ability to see several steps ahead was critical. However, even the most calculated plans were subject to the unpredictability of human nature. Participants occasionally erred, external forces shifted, and new pressures emerged. Zerilli addressed these situations not with force, but with controlled correction. Deviations were met with precision adjustments rather than dramatic retaliation. This minimized exposure while preserving the overall stability of the organization. The educational takeaway in this phase is clear. Leadership that relies on intimidation alone cannot endure. Longevity requires structure, discipline, and the careful calibration of relationships and resources. Yet, structure without flexibility risks stagnation, and discipline without empathy risks alienation. Zerilli managed this balance delicately, though not without cost. Ethically, the contrast between operational efficiency and human impact became stark. Zerilli's system functioned with remarkable order, yet it existed within a framework of coercion and manipulation. Compliance was achieved through expectation and control rather than consent. The line between stability and exploitation blurred, and the moral weight of that line fell silently on the participants and the community. Despite these complexities, Zerilli maintained a guiding principle. Survival without exposure was paramount. Every action was measured against the risk of public scrutiny or law enforcement intervention. He understood that perception could be as influential as reality. Maintaining the appearance of calm and control often mattered more than actual visibility. At this stage, Zerilli also began reflecting on succession, though indirectly. He recognized that the long-term viability of any system depended on the continuity of its culture rather than the charisma of a single individual. Training, mentoring, and the establishment of consistent practices were emphasized. But emotional connection and personal loyalty were secondary. The system needed operatives who understood discipline, secrecy, and long-term thinking above all else. Externally, the city's conditions created a paradox. The more Detroit struggled economically, the more reliant participants became on Zerilli's structure. Dependency reinforced control, but it also deepened systemic weakness. Stability was maintained at the expense of opportunity and autonomy. This duality encapsulated the subtle power dynamics at play. Influence could provide safety, yet simultaneously perpetuate limitation. Ultimately, this period of Zerilli's leadership underscores a profound truth about enduring influence. Real power does not always manifest as visibility or dramatic action. Often, it operates quietly, through reputation, routine, and disciplined expectation. The effectiveness of such power lies in its ability to control without overt force, to shape behavior without public spectacle, and to sustain itself even as external conditions fluctuate. Yet the inherent tension of this approach remains. Efficiency is achieved, but at the cost of human engagement. Stability is preserved, but growth is limited. Compliance is secured, but loyalty is transactional. In the silent spaces between instruction and execution, the subtle consequences accumulate, often unnoticed, yet undeniable. The lesson for observers and future leaders is clear. Influence without ethics is fragile, even when it appears resilient. Systems maintained solely through control and fear endure only as long as vigilance is absolute. True longevity is rooted not in domination but in legitimacy, transparency, and the empowerment of those within the system. As Joseph Zerilli's influence persisted into the later stages of his leadership, the environment around him had transformed into a delicate balance of perception and control. Detroit had become a city of quiet tension. Neighborhoods survived on instinct, industry struggled against decline, and power operated in layers, often invisible to the casual observer. Zerilli's mastery was no longer measured by expansion or profit, but by his ability to preserve a fragile equilibrium. Every decision was no longer about dominance, it was about survival and endurance. At this stage, Zerilli's operations had become almost entirely self-sustaining. The system functioned like a well-oiled machine. Participants knew their roles, boundaries were clear, and expectations were unwavering. Deviations were rare because the rules were embedded into every action and decision. Compliance was maintained less through active supervision and more through habitual adherence. Zerilli understood that predictability, while less glamorous than power displays, was far more effective in maintaining long-term stability. Financial oversight was meticulous. Profits were carefully divided, reinvested, or stored, always with the primary goal of minimizing exposure. Risky ventures were abandoned in favor of incremental stability. Zerilli viewed money not merely as a tool for influence but as a shield. It could create opportunity when necessary, but more importantly, it could protect the organization from sudden disruption. Liquidity and discretion had become the cornerstones of operational security. Communication had become a precise art form. Zerilli rarely needed to issue direct orders, subtle signals sufficed. Instructions were delivered indirectly through trusted intermediaries, reducing the possibility of leaks. People acted in anticipation of what he would expect, not because of what he explicitly demanded. In this way, control extended through perception, with obedience rooted in habit rather than fear alone. Yet, this silent control came at a cost. Emotional distance had become absolute. Zerilli's world had narrowed to the careful management of risk, expectation, and compliance. Associates followed rules because deviation was dangerous, not because they were inspired. Motivation was extracted through consequence rather than opportunity. This approach ensured order but left the system emotionally sterile, a structure operating efficiently yet devoid of passion. Externally, Detroit continued to change. Economic hardship, political shifts, and social unrest created pressure points across the city. These external forces threatened to disrupt patterns of influence, yet Zerilli's organization remained remarkably insulated. He had cultivated layers of separation, ensuring that the core of operations remained untouched by external shocks. His invisibility became a form of armor. However, long-term control created internal stress. Participants were constrained by strict boundaries and limited scope for decision-making. They became dependent on the system for survival, yet increasingly disengaged from its purpose. Zerilli responded to this internal pressure not through engagement, but through further enforcement of routine. Deviations were corrected quietly and immediately, reinforcing the expectation of compliance. Creativity, initiative, and personal ambition were secondary considerations. The consequences of this approach extended into the broader community. While Zerilli's system maintained surface-level stability, it did so at the cost of autonomy, opportunity, and trust. Businesses operated under implicit influence, labor negotiations were subtly guided, and community choice was constrained by invisible pressures. The system preserved order but perpetuated dependence. Individuals adapted to survive rather than to thrive. Zerilli himself had become increasingly isolated. Decision-making required constant vigilance, and even minor errors could create cascading problems. Over time, this isolation became both a protective measure and a psychological burden. He relied more on observation than interaction, more on patterns than dialogue, and more on discipline than persuasion. In doing so, he maintained stability but sacrificed connection. One of his most significant insights during this stage was the power of subtlety. Influence, he realized, does not require visibility. It does not require spectacle. The quieter the control, the harder it is to challenge. By embedding authority within routines, habits, and expectations, Zerilli could shape behavior without confrontation. People often acted as though he were everywhere, while he remained deliberately distant. Yet this invisibility brought its own limitations. Decisions were made with incomplete information. As layers of intermediaries filtered communication, the nuances of context were lost. Mistakes could emerge not from malice but from misunderstanding. Zerilli mitigated this risk through redundancy, verification, and observation, but never through direct interference. He understood that proximity increased exposure, and exposure was the most dangerous threat of all. Ethically, this stage illustrates the quiet erosion that can accompany long-term control. While order was preserved, it existed within a framework that limited autonomy. The system functioned efficiently, yet its participants were restricted, and its surrounding community was shaped by subtle coercion. Stability achieved in this way is not inherently benign. It is efficient, but morally complex. Zerilli's worldview at this stage was shaped by pragmatism. He justified control as a necessary measure to prevent chaos, but the trade-offs were evident. The system's endurance required sacrifice, flexibility, empathy, and transparency. The longer the structure persisted, the more entrenched these trade-offs became. From an educational perspective, this period demonstrates that longevity in any system, criminal or otherwise, is rarely about overt strength. It is about discipline, perception, and subtle enforcement. Power that is invisible, reinforced through routine and reputation, can outlast more dramatic, visible forms of control. Yet the very mechanisms that preserve its silence, restriction, and fear also limit its vitality. The lesson for observers is clear. Systems that operate purely through control, without transparency or engagement, risk stagnation. Survival alone is not success. Stability without legitimacy creates fragility beneath the surface. Influence that is exercised silently may endure, but it leaves behind consequences that are not immediately visible yet profoundly lasting. In the end, Zerilli's operations exemplified a paradox: a quiet, efficient power capable of enduring decades, yet incapable of inspiring loyalty or fostering genuine opportunity. The system functioned not because it was just, but because it was precise, disciplined, and insulated. Survival was achieved, but at the cost of growth, autonomy, and human connection. True strength, this phase suggests, comes not from dominance, but from sustainable influence that empowers rather than restricts. Systems that rely solely on fear, silence, and compliance may endure, but they cannot thrive, evolve, or inspire. Zerilli's quiet control, remarkable in its longevity, ultimately exemplifies endurance without renewal, a powerful lesson in both the possibilities and limitations of unseen authority. By this point in his life, Joseph Zerilli's role had evolved into that of a custodian, rather than a commander. The era of bold moves and rapid expansion had long passed. The environment he operated in had become subtle, measured, and deeply interwoven with both the city and the people who relied on his structure, willingly or unwillingly. Zerilli understood that long-term control demanded patience, restraint, and the constant calibration of influence. It was no longer about domination, it was about preservation. He viewed every interaction, every financial transaction, and every alliance through the lens of endurance. Decisions were calculated not for immediate gain but for long-term stability. Profit was secondary, survival was paramount. Every resource was evaluated for its utility in maintaining balance. This careful, deliberate approach defined his leadership style, invisible yet omnipresent, silent yet commanding. Internal discipline had become absolute. Zerilli's associates understood the boundaries and operated within them with mechanical precision. Deviations were rare, and when they occurred, they were corrected quietly, efficiently, and without fanfare. Zerilli valued predictability over ambition. He had learned over decades that instability, even from within, could be more dangerous than external threats. Fear was not the goal, but was a tool used sparingly to enforce order. Financial control remained meticulous. Cash flow, reinvestment, and asset management were executed with precision. Risky ventures were avoided unless they offered near certain rewards. The focus was on longevity, not expansion. Zerilli understood that visibility, not illegality, was the greater threat in a city increasingly monitored by law enforcement and regulatory agencies. Every dollar was accounted for, every transaction discreet, every exposure minimized. Communication within the organization was carefully filtered. Zerilli rarely spoke directly. He relied on intermediaries' reputation and the shared understanding of expected behavior. His instructions were often implicit, understood by those who had long operated within the system. Obedience became habitual. The silent language of expectation replaced direct commands, and this subtle authority was as effective as overt leadership had ever been. Yet this efficiency came at a cost. Human engagement had diminished. Motivation was transactional rather than inspirational. Loyalty was measured in compliance, not conviction. Associates followed rules because deviation was risky, not because they believed in a shared purpose. Zerilli accepted this trade-off as necessary for survival, even as it hollowed the emotional core of the organization. Externally, Detroit continued to present challenges. Economic instability, political shifts, and societal pressures created constant variables. Zerilli navigated these with quiet adaptation. He avoided confrontation whenever possible, using negotiation, discretion, and reputation to manage outcomes. The city's unpredictability demanded vigilance, but visibility increased risk. Zerilli's solution was calculated distance, influencing outcomes while remaining largely unseen. Community impact was complex. The system Zerilli maintained provided stability, but also reinforced dependency. Neighborhoods adjusted to implicit controls, businesses adapted to hidden influence, and workers found themselves constrained by invisible pressures. Stability was achieved, but autonomy was diminished. The long-term consequences were subtle but profound. Generations of individuals had fewer opportunities, and the culture of compromise became normalized. Zerilli's personal experience reflected this tension. The responsibility of maintaining control exacted a psychological toll. Constant vigilance created isolation. Emotional connection became risky. Every action had potential ripple effects. Decision-making required careful observation, pattern recognition, and the ability to anticipate threats, both external and internal. Even minor miscalculations could have amplified consequences. One of the defining aspects of Zerilli's strategy during this period was subtlety. Influence did not require spectacle. It operated quietly, woven into routines and expectations, allowing him to maintain authority without drawing attention. People acted as though he were everywhere, though his presence was often indirect. This invisibility became both a strength and a limitation. It protected him from scrutiny, but it also limited the depth of insight and connection with those executing the work. The ethical implications were significant. While order and efficiency were maintained, the system depended on coercion and manipulation. Compliance was enforced, autonomy restricted, and community influence reshaped by invisible power. Zerilli justified this as protection, rationalizing that his oversight prevented chaos. Yet, stability maintained in this way masked harm. The system functioned efficiently, but at the expense of fairness, choice, and trust. The long-term sustainability of the organization now depended on culture rather than individual leadership. Zerilli emphasized routines, values of discretion, and a shared understanding of operational expectations. These were designed to endure beyond his personal involvement, ensuring that participants could operate effectively without constant supervision. However, this cultural transmission was limited. Loyalty was procedural, not emotional, and understanding was functional, rather than visionary. The surrounding environment continued to evolve independently. Economic shifts, social change, and the gradual erosion of opportunity created new pressures. Zerilli's system absorbed these shocks through measured adjustment rather than direct intervention. While the structure remained intact, its influence became increasingly about preservation and control rather than growth or adaptation. The organization had become a custodian of continuity, navigating a landscape that offered diminishing rewards and increasing unpredictability. The psychological reality of prolonged control became apparent. Decision-making relied more on patterns than innovation, more on observation than interaction. Isolation intensified, and trust was increasingly procedural. Zerilli's world became defined by surveillance, anticipation, and risk mitigation. Human connection and empathy were sacrificed to preserve efficiency and survival. This period illustrates a crucial lesson. Longevity in any system, criminal or legitimate, is less about force than about careful management, discipline, and subtle influence. Systems maintained purely through coercion and fear may endure for a time, but they become brittle and stagnant. Zerilli's organization was effective, but it was also increasingly constrained, insulated, and dependent on habit rather than adaptability. Ethically, the narrative is clear: influence without consent or transparency carries hidden costs. Stability achieved through control and fear can mask long-term consequences, leaving communities shaped by constraint rather than opportunity. The organization's endurance reflected skill, discipline, and foresight, but also the subtle erosion of freedom and autonomy for those within and around it. From a motivational perspective, the lesson extends beyond crime. Leadership that relies solely on control and visibility risks alienation, fatigue, and stagnation. True influence requires engagement, empowerment, and adaptability. Long-term success is measured not just by survival, but by the ability to inspire, sustain, and create opportunity for others. In the end, Zerilli's legacy during this period is a paradox. His quiet, disciplined influence allowed his organization to endure for decades, yet it did so at the cost of emotional depth, human connection, and community opportunity. Power exercised silently can be effective, but it is neither sustainable nor virtuous without legitimacy, trust, and ethical grounding. By this point in Joseph Zerilli's tenure, the dynamics of control had become almost entirely abstract. The early years of bold expansion, negotiation, and strategic maneuvering had given way to a long period of maintenance, a silent stewardship of influence that required constant vigilance but little spectacle. Detroit itself had transformed under the weight of economic decline, social tension, and shifting industries. The city's struggles mirrored those of Zerilli's organization. Survival had become the central preoccupation, and stability was carefully curated. Zerilli's leadership now resembled the operation of a delicate machine. Every part had a purpose, every role was defined, and any disruption, even minor, could have cascading consequences. Decisions were no longer about seizing opportunity, but about mitigating risk and preserving equilibrium. Predictability became more valuable than profit, and patience replaced ambition. In a world increasingly hostile to exposure, invisibility had become the ultimate advantage. Internal discipline had grown absolute. Participants understood that deviation from established routines was not merely frowned upon, it was dangerous. Rules were enforced subtly but firmly. Zerilli had refined the art of correction, intervening only when necessary, and always in a manner that minimized visibility. Quiet adjustments maintained compliance, reinforced authority, and reduced the risk of scrutiny. Fear was present but managed. It was a tool, not the foundation of loyalty. Financial management reflected the same principles. Aggressive investments or risky ventures were abandoned in favor of conservative, sustainable practices. Zerilli focused on preserving liquidity and maintaining discretion. Money was treated not just as a resource for influence, but as a buffer against uncertainty. Each transaction was carefully considered for its potential to expose the organization to risk. The financial structure prioritized endurance over expansion, stability over profit, and survival over reputation. Communication had become nearly entirely indirect. Zerilli rarely addressed associates directly. Instead, messages were conveyed through trusted intermediaries, long-established habits, and shared cultural understanding. The organization operated on assumptions. What Zerilli expected became instinctual behavior. This silent, habitual obedience reinforced authority while minimizing exposure. Yet it also created a system that was dependent on perception rather than explicit control. However, efficiency carried its own cost. Emotional engagement had dwindled. Loyalty was measured by compliance, not conviction. Motivation derived from consequence rather than opportunity or inspiration. While the organization remained functional, it operated in a vacuum of human connection. Zerilli accepted this as necessary, yet he was aware of the subtle erosion of morale and initiative within his ranks. Externally, Detroit continued to present challenges. Economic instability, rising oversight, and shifting social conditions created uncertainty at every level. Zerilli navigated these challenges through measured observation and minimal intervention. He relied on reputation, history, and subtle influence to maintain order rather than overt control. By remaining largely unseen, he could guide outcomes while avoiding unnecessary exposure. The wider community experienced the indirect consequences of this approach. While Zerilli's organization maintained stability, the mechanisms of influence subtly restricted autonomy. Businesses operated under implicit constraints, individuals faced reduced opportunity, and neighborhoods adjusted to the invisible hand of control. Order was achieved, but at the cost of agency and freedom. Psychologically, long-term vigilance had taken its toll on Zerilli. The responsibility of maintaining a vast, intricate network demanded constant awareness. Isolation became inevitable. Decisions were made more from observation than direct experience. Detachment became a necessity for clarity, but also reinforced the emotional distance that had grown over decades. Every choice was shadowed by the understanding that missteps could have significant ripple effects. One of the most significant strategies Zerilli employed during this period was the cultivation of subtlety. Influence did not require visible presence. The silent operation of expectation, habit, and perception maintained authority more effectively than overt action ever could. People acted as though he were omnipresent even when he was not. This quiet control minimized risk while ensuring compliance. Yet, invisibility had limitations. Decisions were increasingly informed by incomplete information. Layers of intermediaries filtered communication, reducing nuance and context. Mistakes could occur not from malice but from misinterpretation. Zerilli countered this with redundancy, verification, and careful monitoring, but never direct interference. As proximity increased exposure, ethically, this stage of leadership demonstrates the subtle erosion that long-term control can create. The system functioned efficiently, but it relied on coercion and implicit manipulation. Compliance was enforced, freedom was constrained, and opportunity was shaped by invisible hands. Zerilli rationalized this as protection, yet the costs, both human and societal, were undeniable. Succession planning was another focus. Zerilli understood that longevity depended on cultural continuity rather than individual brilliance. The values of discipline, discretion, and procedural loyalty were reinforced. Yet this culture was limited. It encouraged procedural compliance rather than creative thinking, moral judgment, or personal initiative. The organization could endure, but it could not inspire. External forces continued to evolve independently of the organization. Economic shifts, social movements, and law enforcement scrutiny created unpredictable variables. Zerilli's system absorbed these through subtle adaptation. It remained functional, but influence had become preservation rather than expansion. The organization now existed to maintain stability within a city that was increasingly unstable. This stage highlights a critical lesson about the nature of power. Longevity is less about dominance or visibility, and more about discipline, subtlety, and the careful calibration of relationships. Influence that operates invisibly may endure for decades, but it risks stagnation and dependency. Compliance can replace conviction, stability can mask ethical compromise, and silence can conceal both efficiency and harm. From a motivational perspective, the chapter underscores that leadership is not just about control, but about empowerment. Sustainable influence requires transparency, engagement, and accountability. Systems that operate solely on fear and expectation endure only temporarily and leave long-term consequences in their wake. In conclusion, Zerilli's era of silent control illustrates a paradox. Enduring influence can preserve order, yet it can also erode freedom, initiative, and ethical integrity. Efficiency and stability are achievable, but they come at a cost. True strength is measured not by duration alone, but by the ability to inspire, empower, and sustain both people and systems. His quiet, Discipline management offers lessons in both the effectiveness and the limitations of unseen authority. By the time Joseph Zerilli reached the later stages of his influence, his leadership had evolved into a mastery of endurance, subtlety, and silent authority. The era of visible power, of decisive action, public negotiation, and expansion was long behind him. Detroit itself had become a city of quiet tension. Industries were shifting, communities were adjusting to limited opportunities, and power existed in layers, often imperceptible to those not directly involved. Zerilli understood that the most effective form of control was often the one least noticed. It was not through overt displays of force that he maintained authority, but through the consistent, precise, and disciplined management of perception. Internal discipline remained the backbone of his system. Every participant had defined responsibilities and understood the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Compliance was not optional, it was habitual. Rules were enforced consistently, but subtly, without unnecessary confrontation. Zerilli believed that quiet reinforcement was more effective than overt punishment. People acted correctly because it was easier, safer, and more predictable than acting otherwise. In this way, authority extended through expectation rather than instruction, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of obedience. Financial management reflected the same philosophy. Risky ventures were abandoned in favor of conservative, sustainable strategies. Cash reserves were carefully maintained to withstand unexpected disruptions, and financial operations were designed to remain largely invisible to external scrutiny. Zerilli treated money not merely as a tool for power, but as a buffer against instability. Every transaction was measured against its potential impact on security, discretion, and long-term endurance. Profit was secondary, preservation was paramount. Communication within the organization had become an art of subtlety. Zerilli rarely needed to speak directly. Trusted intermediaries carried messages, and long-standing cultural norms guided behavior. Instruction was often implicit, relying on a shared understanding of expectation. This approach minimized exposure while maximizing efficiency, though it came at the cost of personal engagement. Associates were compliant but not inspired, and the organization functioned more as a mechanism than a community. Externally, Detroit presented constant challenges. Economic uncertainty, shifting political landscapes, and evolving social conditions created a volatile backdrop. Zerilli navigated these pressures with quiet observation, relying on reputation and the anticipation of behavior rather than direct confrontation. His presence was often invisible, yet his influence shaped outcomes across neighborhoods, businesses, and industries. People acted as though he were everywhere, even when he remained distant. This quiet control carried both advantages and limitations. The system was resilient, insulated from many external shocks, and capable of sustaining itself with minimal direct oversight. Yet it was also brittle in unexpected ways. Because decision-making was filtered through intermediaries and habitual expectation, nuances were easily lost and misinterpretation could occur. Zerilli mitigated this risk through careful observation, redundancy, and verification, but the underlying vulnerability remained. Human impact of prolonged control became increasingly evident. Emotional connection had diminished within the organization. Motivation derived from consequence rather than opportunity. Compliance replaced loyalty, and habit replaced initiative. While the system was effective, it lacked vitality. Zerilli accepted this trade-off, recognizing that long-term survival often demands efficiency at the expense of engagement. Community consequences mirrored these internal dynamics. While Zerilli's structure maintained stability, it also imposed subtle limitations on autonomy and opportunity. Businesses operated under implicit guidance, labor actions were subtly constrained, and neighborhoods adapted to invisible pressures. Stability was achieved, but at the cost of freedom and innovation. Those within the system had limited choices, and those outside had experienced indirect influence that shaped their environment without consent. Zerilli's personal vigilance intensified during this period. The responsibility of sustaining a complex, multifaceted network required constant awareness. Every decision was weighed for immediate and long-term impact. Isolation became a necessary condition as proximity increased the risk of exposure. Emotional detachment, once a protective measure, became integral to effective management. He observed, calculated, and intervened with precision, maintaining equilibrium while minimizing visibility. One of the defining strategies of this stage was the cultivation of subtlety. Influence was exerted through expectation and habit, often without direct action. People anticipated what Zerilli would tolerate and adjusted behavior accordingly. This silent enforcement created efficiency, reduced risk, and reinforced authority. It was a form of power that required patience, observation, and an acute understanding of human behavior. Ethically, the situation was complex. Stability was maintained through control and coercion rather than consent. Compliance was enforced, autonomy constrained, and opportunity shaped by invisible influence. Zerilli rationalized this as protection, believing that his management prevented chaos. Yet the costs, psychological, social, and moral, were significant. Stability existed, but it was achieved through constraint rather than empowerment. Succession and legacy were ongoing concerns. Zerilli understood that endurance depended not on personal skill alone, but on cultural continuity. He reinforced the values of discretion, patience, and procedural loyalty, ensuring that the system could function even in his absence. Yet this culture emphasized compliance over creativity, discipline over vision, and routine over innovation. The organization could endure, but it could not inspire. Externally, Detroit's challenges continued to evolve. Social dynamics, economic shifts, and regulatory scrutiny created variables beyond Zerilli's control. His strategy relied on absorption rather than confrontation. The organization adapted quietly, adjusted expectations, and preserved stability. Influence had become preservation, and preservation had become the ultimate measure of success. Psychologically, the long-term demands of leadership were profound. Zerilli's world was defined by observation, anticipation, and mitigation. Isolation, vigilance, and detachment became necessary for clarity and survival. Emotional engagement was a liability. Control required focus, discipline, and calculated distance. Even small deviations or misinterpretations could produce significant ripple effects, and every decision was shadowed by potential consequence. From an educational perspective, this period illustrates that endurance in complex systems depends more on subtle management than on dramatic action. Longevity is rooted in discipline, perception, and expectation rather than visibility. Yet systems maintained solely through control and fear risk stagnation, brittleness, and ethical compromise. Compliance can replace commitment, stability can mask moral cost, and invisibility can conceal both efficiency and harm. The motivational lesson is clear. True leadership balances authority with engagement. Sustainable influence requires transparency, trust, and empowerment. Systems that rely solely on control endure only temporarily, and their long-term impact may be corrosive. Zerilli's era demonstrates both the effectiveness and the limits of unseen power, revealing that survival alone is not the measure of success. It is the balance between stability, opportunity, and ethical integrity that defines true strength. By this point in Joseph Zerilli's life, leadership had transformed into an exercise in quiet endurance. The city of Detroit had become a complex, unpredictable landscape, shaped by economic decline, social shifts, and the legacy of decades of organized influence. Zerilli's authority no longer depended on public presence or dramatic displays of power. It existed as an invisible current, a network of expectation, habit, and disciplined compliance that extended throughout neighborhoods, businesses, and social circles. Survival, stability, and subtlety were the guiding principles. Zerilli's internal operations had become highly structured. Every participant knew their responsibilities, boundaries, and limitations. Deviations from established routines were rare and corrected swiftly, often without direct confrontation. Compliance had become habitual and efficiency had replaced initiative. In this environment, authority operated silently, reinforced through expectation and observation rather than instruction. People acted according to what they anticipated Zerilli would tolerate, creating a self-regulating system that minimized risk. Financial control remained a central concern. Investments were conservative and profits were managed with discretion. Risky ventures were avoided unless the potential rewards outweighed exposure. Zerilli understood that money was not only a tool for influence but also a shield against instability. Each transaction was carefully considered, not merely for immediate gain, but for its long-term impact on security, discretion, and the organization's continuity. Preservation had replaced expansion as the highest priority. Communication within the network was indirect, precise, and filtered. Zerilli rarely addressed participants personally. Messages were conveyed through trusted intermediaries, long-standing routines, and the implicit understanding of expected behavior. Obedience had become procedural, instinctual, and largely independent of direct oversight. This system minimized exposure and risk, but came at the cost of engagement and creativity. Motivation was derived from consequence rather than inspiration. Externally, Detroit's shifting environment required constant adaptation. Economic fluctuations, social unrest, and regulatory pressures introduced variables beyond Zerilli's control. He responded not with confrontation, but with observation, discretion, and subtle adjustment. By remaining largely unseen, he could influence outcomes while avoiding scrutiny. Reputation became a tool as effective as direct action, guiding behavior through perception rather than overt instruction. The human consequences of this approach were profound. Emotional distance within the organization was deep. Loyalty was measured in compliance, not conviction. Initiative was limited, and morale depended on routine rather than inspiration. Zerilli accepted these costs as necessary for preservation, but he was acutely aware of the subtle erosion of vitality within his network. The system functioned efficiently, but it was emotionally hollow. Community impact mirrored these internal dynamics. Stability was maintained, but it was achieved through invisible influence rather than empowerment. Businesses operated under implicit guidance, labor actions were subtly constrained, and neighborhoods adapted to pressures that were never openly stated. Order was preserved, yet autonomy, opportunity, and choice were limited. The system provided security, but at the cost of freedom. Zerilli's personal vigilance intensified. Sustaining such a complex network required constant observation, anticipation, and precise intervention. Isolation became a necessary condition. Emotional detachment allowed clarity and reduced risk, but it also reinforced the sense of distance between leader and participants. Every decision carried potential ripple effects, and even small miscalculations could have amplified consequences. Subtlety became the hallmark of leadership. Influence was exerted through expectation, habit, and perception, rather than overt action. People anticipated Zerilli's limits, adjusted their behavior accordingly, and acted without direct supervision. This silent enforcement minimized risk, ensured compliance, and reinforced authority. Patience, observation, and the study of human behavior became Zerilli's most effective tools. Yet invisibility had its limits. As layers of intermediaries filtered information, nuances were lost. Misinterpretations could occur without malice, and small errors could escalate if unchecked. Zerilli mitigated these risks through verification, redundancy, and careful monitoring, but the potential for systemic fragility remained. Efficiency had replaced resilience in some areas, and predictability came at the cost of adaptability. Ethically, this stage illustrates the tension between control and consequence. The organization functioned effectively, yet it relied on coercion, implicit manipulation, and restricted autonomy. Compliance was enforced, freedom limited, and opportunity shaped by invisible influence. Zerilli rationalized this as protection, believing that his guidance prevented chaos. But the hidden costs were real. Morale, initiative, and community trust were constrained, even as order persisted. Succession and continuity remained central concerns. Zerilli recognized that the organization's longevity depended on cultural transmission rather than personal oversight. He reinforced values of discretion, patience, and procedural loyalty to ensure the system could function independently. Yet this culture emphasized compliance over innovation, routine over creativity, and discipline over vision. The organization could endure, but it could not inspire or adapt beyond its carefully controlled framework. External pressures continued to evolve. Social movements, economic shifts, and law enforcement scrutiny created unpredictable challenges. Zerilli's strategy was adaptive, relying on subtle adjustments rather than confrontation. The organization absorbed shocks quietly, maintaining internal equilibrium while navigating a changing city. Influence had shifted from expansion to preservation, and preservation had become the ultimate metric of success. Psychologically, the long-term demands of this leadership were profound. Zerilli's world was defined by observation, anticipation, and mitigation. Isolation, vigilance, and detachment became necessary for clarity and survival. Emotional engagement was a liability. Focus, discipline, and precision were essential. Every decision was shadowed by potential consequence, and the cost of error was magnified by the system's complexity. From a leadership perspective, this period highlights the power of subtle influence. Enduring authority does not require visibility or force. It thrives on discipline, expectation, and perception. Longevity depends on careful management rather than dramatic action, yet reliance on control alone risks brittleness, stagnation, and ethical compromise. Compliance can replace conviction, stability can mask moral cost, and invisibility can conceal both efficiency and harm. The motivational takeaway is clear. True leadership balances authority with empowerment. Sustainable influence requires transparency, trust, and engagement. Systems built solely on control may endure temporarily, but their long-term effects can be corrosive. Zerilli's approach demonstrates the effectiveness and limits of silent power, revealing that survival alone is not success. True strength is measured by the ability to maintain stability while fostering autonomy, opportunity, and ethical integrity. As Joseph Zerilli moved deeper into the later decades of his life, the nature of his influence had reached a point of quiet permanence. The city of Detroit, scarred by economic decline and shifting industries, had become a complex terrain of survival and adaptation. Zerilli's authority no longer required direct confrontation or overt displays of power. Instead, it existed as a pervasive, invisible current, guiding behavior through expectation, habit, and disciplined routine. He had become less a figure of command and more the custodian of an enduring system, a silent force that shaped outcomes without revealing itself. Internal operations had become remarkably self-sufficient. Participants understood their responsibilities and the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Deviations from established routines were rare, and when they occurred, they were addressed subtly but decisively. Zerilli's philosophy emphasized predictability over ambition and consistency over inspiration. Compliance was ingrained, not enforced, and efficiency had replaced initiative. In this environment, authority was exercised silently with minimal intervention, yet it remained absolute. Financial oversight continued to be a cornerstone of Zerilli's strategy. High-risk ventures were abandoned in favor of stable, sustainable operations. Cash reserves were carefully maintained, serving as both a buffer against disruption and a means of discreet influence. Each financial decision was evaluated for long-term impact, with preservation of the organization taking precedence over immediate profit. The emphasis on caution ensured endurance but also limited growth and opportunity. Communication within the organization had grown highly refined. Zerilli rarely spoke directly. Messages were transmitted through trusted intermediaries and reinforced by long-established routines and norms. Participants acted according to anticipated expectations rather than explicit instruction. This system minimized exposure and risk, creating a network of habitual compliance. While it maintained efficiency, it also fostered emotional distance as motivation was derived from consequence rather than shared purpose. Externally, Detroit presented constant challenges. Social unrest, regulatory scrutiny, and economic instability created unpredictable pressures. Zerilli navigated these with quiet observation, subtle adjustment, and indirect influence. By remaining largely unseen, he could shape outcomes without attracting attention. Reputation, perception, and anticipation became as powerful as any direct action. People responded not to orders, but to the expectation of what was acceptable and what would be tolerated. The human cost of prolonged control was increasingly evident. Emotional engagement had been sacrificed in favor of precision and survival. Loyalty was procedural rather than heartfelt. Initiative was limited, and morale was maintained through habit rather than inspiration. Zerilli accepted these trade-offs as necessary to preserve order and avoid disruption, but he was keenly aware that they eroded the vitality of his organization over time. Community consequences reflected the internal dynamics of Zerilli's influence. Stability existed, but it came with subtle constraints. Businesses operated under implicit guidance, labor actions were influenced quietly, and neighborhoods adapted to pressures that were rarely visible. Autonomy and choice were limited, yet the system provided a framework within which survival and basic order were possible. The impact was complex: security at the expense of freedom, order at the expense of opportunity. Zerilli's vigilance intensified as he aged. Sustaining such a large and intricate system required constant observation and meticulous oversight. Isolation became both a protective measure and a psychological burden. Emotional detachment allowed clarity and precision, reducing the risk of error, yet it also reinforced the separation between leader and participants. Every decision carried weight, as miscalculations could have wide-reaching consequences. Subtlety remained the defining feature of leadership. Influence was exercised not through confrontation but through expectation and habit. Participants anticipated Zerilli's limits and adjusted their behavior accordingly, reducing the need for direct intervention. This silent authority was effective because it was internalized, not imposed. It required patience, acute observation, and a deep understanding of human nature. Yet the system was not without its vulnerabilities. Layers of intermediaries filtered information, reducing nuance and increasing the potential for misinterpretation. Errors could arise not from malice, but from misunderstanding. Zerilli mitigated this risk through verification, redundancy, and careful monitoring. Yet the system's reliance on habitual compliance introduced a quiet brittleness. Efficiency had replaced flexibility, and predictability sometimes masked fragility. Ethically, this period highlights the tension between control and consequence. The system functioned effectively, yet it depended on manipulation and constrained autonomy. Compliance was maintained, freedom limited, and opportunity shaped by unseen forces. Zerilli rationalized this as protection and the prevention of chaos, yet the social and moral costs were significant. Stability came at the expense of engagement, empowerment, and ethical transparency. Succession planning became increasingly important. Zerilli recognized that the organization's longevity depended on cultural continuity rather than individual oversight. He emphasized discretion, patience, and procedural loyalty, ensuring that the system could operate independently. Yet this culture prioritized conformity over creativity, routine over vision, and obedience over initiative. The organization could endure, but it was limited in its ability to adapt or inspire beyond survival. Externally, Detroit's conditions remained volatile. Economic and social pressures continued to test the resilience of the system. Zerilli's strategy relied on subtle adaptation, allowing the organization to absorb shocks quietly. Influence had shifted from expansion to preservation, and the primary measure of success was survival. The city and the organization were intertwined, each shaping and responding to the other in a delicate balance of unseen forces. Psychologically, the long-term demands of leadership were profound. Zerilli's focus was defined by observation, anticipation, and mitigation. Isolation, discipline, and detachment were necessary for clarity and survival. Emotional engagement was a liability. Every decision carried the weight of potential consequences, and even minor errors could cascade into significant disruption. Vigilance and precision were the constants of daily life. From a leadership perspective, this stage illustrates the power of subtle, disciplined influence. True authority does not always manifest through visibility or force. It often operates through expectation, routine, and perception. Longevity depends on careful management, not dramatic action. Yet reliance on control alone introduces risks of brittleness, stagnation, and ethical compromise. Compliance can replace conviction, stability can conceal mortal cost, and invisibility can hide both efficiency and harm. The motivational lesson is clear: enduring leadership requires balance. Authority must be tempered with engagement, empowerment, and ethical grounding. Systems maintained solely through control may endure temporarily, but their long-term effects can erode trust, opportunity, and vitality. Zerilli's era demonstrates both the effectiveness and limitations of silent power, showing that survival alone is not sufficient. True strength lies in preserving stability while fostering autonomy, opportunity, and ethical integrity. By the time Joseph Zerilli entered the final phase of his leadership, his influence had become an almost invisible force, a subtle current that shaped outcomes without ever revealing itself. The city of Detroit, grappling with economic decline, social instability, and the slow erosion of industry, had become a landscape of quiet survival, and Zerilli's authority operated within it like a silent guardian, ever present, rarely seen, yet profoundly influential. His role was no longer about commanding loyalty or enforcing expansion. It was about preserving equilibrium, maintaining routines, and ensuring that the structures he had built could endure beyond his personal involvement. The internal organization had matured into a system that functioned with near mechanical precision. Every member understood their responsibilities, the scope of their authority, and the limits of acceptable behavior. Deviations were corrected with quiet efficiency, ensuring that the machinery continued to operate without disruption. Zerilli valued predictability above all else. It minimized risk and reduced the likelihood of exposure. Authority no longer needed to be asserted through overt action. It existed in the habits and expectations of those within the system. Financial oversight remained rigorous. Zerilli's approach emphasized caution, sustainability, and discretion. Risky ventures had been replaced by steady, controlled operations designed to preserve liquidity and minimize exposure. Money was not only a tool for influence, but a safeguard against uncertainty. Every financial move was calculated for its long-term impact, ensuring the organization's endurance in a city increasingly hostile to visibility. Profit was secondary, the survival of the system took precedence. Communication had evolved into a language of implication. Zerilli rarely spoke directly to associates. Instructions were transmitted through trusted intermediaries, long-standing routines, and the implicit understanding of expectation. Compliance was instinctual, not forced. Participants anticipated Zerilli's tolerance levels, adjusting behavior accordingly. This subtle form of authority minimized risk, preserved control, and ensured efficiency, yet it came at the cost of personal engagement and emotional connection. Motivation was derived from consequence rather than opportunity or inspiration. Externally, Detroit presented constant challenges. Economic fluctuations, social unrest, and regulatory oversight created pressures that could not always be predicted. Zerilli navigated these forces with quiet observation and minimal intervention, influencing outcomes indirectly while maintaining invisibility. Reputation and perception became tools as powerful as direct action. People behaved as though Zerilli were omnipresent, though he often remained distant, allowing the expectation of authority to enforce compliance. The human consequences of this approach were profound. Emotional engagement had long since been sacrificed for discipline and precision. Loyalty was measured in compliance rather than conviction. Initiative was constrained, and morale depended on adherence to routine. Zerilli recognized these costs as necessary to preserve the integrity of the organization, but he also understood that such efficiency created a sterile environment devoid of creativity and passion. The community experienced the impact of Zerilli's influence in subtle but pervasive ways. Stability existed, but it was achieved through invisible constraints. Businesses operated under implicit guidance, labor actions were quietly influenced, and neighborhoods adapted to pressures that were rarely articulated. Autonomy and opportunity were limited, yet the system provided predictability and security. The effect was a complex balance: order at the expense of freedom, survival at the expense of opportunity. Zerilli's personal vigilance remained intense. Maintaining a vast, intricate network required constant observation, pattern recognition, and strategic intervention. Isolation became both a protective measure and a psychological necessity. Emotional detachment allowed clarity and reduced risk, though it also reinforced the separation between leader and participants. Every decision carried potential ripple effects, and even minor errors could create significant consequences. Subtlety was the hallmark of this stage of leadership. Influence was exercised through expectation and habitual behavior rather than direct enforcement. People internalized the norms of the organization, anticipating what was acceptable and adjusting accordingly. This silent authority reduced risk, ensured compliance, and reinforced Zerilli's power without requiring constant intervention. Patience, observation, and understanding human behavior became essential tools of governance. Yet invisibility had limitations. Communication filtered through intermediaries could lose nuance, creating the potential for misinterpretation. Errors could arise not from malice but from misunderstanding. Zerilli mitigated these risks with redundancy, verification, and careful observation, but the underlying fragility of a system reliant on habitual compliance remained. Efficiency had replaced flexibility, and predictability could conceal vulnerabilities. Ethically, this period illustrates the tension between control and consequence. System functioned effectively, but it relied on manipulation, constraint, and invisible influence. Compliance was maintained, freedom limited, and opportunity shaped by unseen forces. Zerilli rationalized this as protection and the prevention of disorder, but the social and moral costs were significant. Order came at the expense of engagement, initiative, and autonomy. Succession planning became increasingly crucial. Zerilli recognized that the organization's longevity depended on cultural transmission rather than individual leadership. He reinforced the values of discretion, patience, and procedural loyalty, ensuring that the system could operate independently. Yet this culture prioritized conformity over innovation, routine over creativity, and obedience over initiative. While the organization could endure, it lacked the capacity to adapt beyond preservation. Detroit's external pressure continued to evolve. Social, economic, and regulatory challenges tested the organization's resilience. Zerilli's response was subtle adaptation, allowing the system to absorb shocks quietly. Influence had shifted from expansion to preservation, with the survival of the network becoming the primary measure of success. The city and the organization existed in a symbiotic relationship, each influencing and adapting to the other in a careful, often unseen balance. Psychologically, the demands of leadership were profound. Zerilli's focus was defined by observation, anticipation, and mitigation. Isolation, discipline, and detachment were necessary for clarity and survival. Emotional engagement was a liability, and every decision carried the weight of potential consequence. Long-term vigilance created both strength and a quiet tension that shaped every interaction, every choice, and every outcome. From a leadership perspective, this phase demonstrates the power and limitations of subtle influence. Authority can endure without visibility, relying on expectation, habit, and perception. Longevity depends on disciplined management rather than dramatic action. Yet reliance on control alone introduces brittleness, stagnation, and ethical compromise. Compliance can replace conviction, stability can mask moral cost, and invisibility can conceal both effectiveness and harm. The motivational lesson is evident. Sustainable leadership balances authority with engagement, transparency, and empowerment. Systems that rely solely on control may endure temporarily, but long-term consequences can erode trust, opportunity, and vitality. Zerilli's era demonstrates the duality of silent power, its effectiveness, and its limitations, showing that survival alone is insufficient. True strength lies in preserving stability while fostering autonomy, opportunity, and ethical integrity, leaving a legacy that extends beyond mere endurance. As Joseph Zerilli approached the final years of his influence, his leadership had become an exercise in enduring presence rather than visible command. Detroit, a city shaped by decades of industrial rise and decline, social change, and economic uncertainty, was now a landscape in which his influence flowed quietly but unmistakably. Zerilli's authority had evolved into a system of expectation, routine, and disciplined observation, a silent architecture that maintained order, shaped outcomes, and ensured the survival of his organization without overt intervention. This stage of leadership was defined not by expansion, confrontation, or spectacle, but by preservation, subtlety, and the careful orchestration of unseen forces. The organization itself functioned with remarkable efficiency. Every member understood their role, limitations, and responsibilities. Deviations from established practices were corrected with quiet precision, often without direct confrontation. Compliance had become habitual, and the culture of the organization reinforced predictability over initiative. In this environment, authority was exercised through implicit understanding, observation, and the anticipation of expected behavior. People operated almost automatically, guided by the invisible hand of Zerilli's oversight. Financial operations were carefully controlled. Risky ventures had long been replaced by conservative, stable projects that preserved resources and minimized exposure. Money served not just as a tool for influence, but as a safeguard against uncertainty and instability. Every transaction was calculated not merely for immediate gain, but for its potential to secure long-term survival. Zerilli prioritized preservation over profit, longevity over visibility, and subtlety over spectacle. Communication within the organization relied almost entirely on indirect methods. Zerilli rarely spoke directly to associates. Instead, trusted intermediaries conveyed messages, and long-standing cultural norms shaped behavior. Participants anticipated the leader's expectations and acted accordingly. This created a system in which obedience was internalized rather than enforced. Efficiency increased, risk decreased, but the organization became emotionally sterile, with motivation rooted in consequence rather than inspiration. Externally, Detroit remained a complex and shifting environment. Economic volatility, social unrest, and regulatory scrutiny created challenges that could not always be predicted. Zerilli responded through observation, strategic adaptation, and minimal intervention. His presence was felt through reputation and expectation rather than visibility, guiding behavior without direct confrontation. The city had adapted to his influence as much as he had adapted to the city, creating a delicate, mutually dependent balance. The human consequences of prolonged control were profound. Emotional engagement within the organization was minimal. Loyalty was measured in compliance, not commitment. Initiative was limited, and morale was sustained through routine rather than inspiration. While the system remained efficient, it lacked vitality and creativity. Zerilli accepted these sacrifices as necessary for stability, but he recognized that such a method of leadership came at a cost to both the people within his organization and the broader community. Community impact mirrored these internal dynamics. Stability was maintained, but at the expense of autonomy and opportunity. Businesses operated under implicit constraints, labor actions were subtly influenced, and neighborhoods adjusted to the invisible framework of control. Predictability and security existed, but choice and freedom were limited. The system provided order, yet it imposed subtle restrictions on the lives of those who interacted with it, shaping behavior quietly and effectively. Zerilli's personal vigilance remained intense. Sustaining a complex network required constant observation, careful analysis, and precise intervention. Isolation became both protective and inevitable. Emotional detachment allowed clarity and reduced risk, but it also reinforced the separation between leader and associates. Each decision carried weight, as missteps could create ripple effects that were difficult to contain. Subtlety remained the defining feature of his leadership. Influence was exercised through the anticipation of behavior, the internalization of rules, and the quiet reinforcement of norms. Participants operated as though he were omnipresent, though his actions were deliberate and measured. Silent authority ensured compliance, minimized risk, and preserved stability without constant intervention. Patience, observation, and an acute understanding of human nature became his primary tools of governance. Yet the system retained inherent vulnerabilities, filtered through multiple layers, creating the potential for misinterpretation. Mistakes could arise not from intent, but from misunderstanding. Zerilli mitigated these risks through redundancy, careful monitoring, and indirect verification, but the reliance on habitual compliance introduced quiet fragility. Efficiency had replaced flexibility, and predictability could mask potential instability. Ethically, this stage of Zerilli's leadership illustrates the tension between stability and human cost. Compliance was achieved through subtle coercion, autonomy was limited, and opportunity was shaped by unseen forces. Zerilli justified his approach as a means of preserving order, believing that his oversight prevented chaos. Yet the cost was significant. Initiative, freedom, and moral clarity were constrained, and the broader impact on the community was quietly profound. Succession planning became a central concern. Zerilli recognized that the endurance of his organization depended on cultural continuity rather than personal oversight. He reinforced values of discretion, patience, and procedural loyalty, ensuring the system could operate independently of his direct involvement. Yet the culture emphasized conformity over creativity, routine over innovation, and obedience over initiative. While longevity was secured, the organization's capacity for evolution remained limited. Detroit's challenges continued to evolve, testing the resilience of Zerilli's carefully constructed network. Economic uncertainty, social change, and regulatory oversight demanded subtle adaptation rather than confrontation. The organization absorbed shocks quietly, preserving internal stability. Influence had shifted from expansion to preservation, with survival becoming the ultimate measure of success. The city and the organization existed in a symbiotic balance, each influencing the other through unseen mechanisms. Psychologically, the long-term demands of this leadership were immense. Zerilli's life was defined by observation, anticipation, and mitigation. Isolation, vigilance, and detachment became essential for clarity and control. Emotional involvement was a liability, and every decision carried potential consequence. Constant awareness and meticulous planning were the tools through which stability was maintained. From a leadership perspective, this final phase underscores the effectiveness and limitations of subtle, disciplined influence. Authority can endure without visibility, relying on expectation, habit, and perception. Yet systems dependent solely on control risk stagnation, brittleness, and ethical compromise. Compliance can replace conviction, stability can mask moral cost, and invisibility can conceal both efficiency and harm. The overarching lesson of Zerilli's legacy is clear. True leadership is measured not by duration alone, but by the ability to preserve stability while fostering opportunity, autonomy, and ethical integrity. Influence that relies solely on control may endure temporarily, but it is insufficient to cultivate vitality, trust, or resilience. Zerilli's era demonstrates the paradox of unseen power. It can maintain order and survive decades, yet it cannot fully inspire, empower, or transform. In the end, Joseph Zerilli's story is one of silent mastery, enduring influence, and calculated restraint. His life illustrates the power of patience, observation, and subtle authority, while also revealing the human and ethical costs of leadership exercised through compliance rather than engagement. His legacy endures as a lesson. Stability is essential, but its highest expression lies in balance between authority and empowerment, discipline and creativity, survival and ethical responsibility. True power, when exercised wisely, preserves not only the system but also the humanity within it.